Okay, folks, the network is nothing but prompt, so let's get going because a couple of brief announcements just to start with. Firstly, I'm Steve Piasecki from the Supportive Housing Network. I'll be moderating this panel, so if it gets out of control, blame me. Two things really to note. One is that Diane Yentel is not sitting next to me, but she is going to be ably replaced by her colleague, Lindsay Duval, also from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So I guess, what should we say? Ask her the tough questions or treat her gently as you want. And Congressman Torres has only got an hour to spend with us, so till 11:30. That's why I really want to get started and give some time before he leaves for you in the audience to ask some questions. So that said, I'll start by just briefly introducing the panel more specifically. Congressman Torres, who you all know here from New York City, Congressional District NY 15, has been a longtime champion of affordable housing. He sits on the Financial Services Committee, where he hit the ground running at the beginning of his tenure and continues to fight the good fight for all things affordable housing, from NYCHA to supportive housing in our world, and the overall HUD funding packages. So we welcome Congressman Torres to the panel. Next, in the middle, happy to introduce someone who might be known to many of you, Rob Robertson. Rob has been in our housing world for a lengthy period of time. He has been active as a member of the New York City Continuum of Care for many, many years. And he also does teaching at the New School, and as well as is involved in several international activities around housing and homelessness. So we welcome Rob to the panel. I also want to say he's the winner of the 2023 University of Dayton Oscar Romero Award, a Human Rights Award. So we're happy to have Rob on the panel as well. And again, Lindsay, I could tell you all about Diane because I got her biography in front of me, but I can also tell you that Lindsay is one of us. She is a New Yorker coming down on the train from Kingston, New York, but has worked for one of our member agencies up there, Hudson River Housing, doing policy and advocacy work for a lengthy period of time. And she recently, a couple of years? Year and a half, left the world of working for Hudson River Housing and joined the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So welcome, Lindsay. Welcome panelists. And if I may, I want to start off with a question focusing on one of the many newsworthy tragedies that faced us here, in particular in New York City, the tragic death of Jason Neely, which actually happened only blocks away from here. Could you, panelists, share your reflections on that incident, what it means, what lessons we can learn? And Congressman, if you don't mind, I'll start with you and work my way across.
Testing. First, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. I think Jordan Neely, right?
Jordan, I'm sorry.
Jordan, right. For me, the public response to Jordan Neely was almost as tragic as his death.
Yes.
Because it reveals a society that continues to systematically dehumanize those with severe mental illness. As far as I can tell, based on the facts that I've seen, he was not armed with any weapon. He did not attack any person. There might have been people who were made to feel threatened, but if feeling threatened becomes a justification for choking someone to death, then we're no longer a civilized society. But I think the death of Jordan Neely reminds us that there's no set of people whom we're failing more miserably than the severely mentally ill, who are often left to languish in our prisons, in our jails, on our streets, in our subways. The fact that Rikers Island is one of the largest providers of mental health care in the country is a stain on the soul of our nation. And so I suspect, hopefully, I think we're going to look back 50 years from now and look to our approach to the severely mentally ill as inhuman and immoral and medieval. So For me, this is a teachable moment. And if Jordan Neely had access to supportive housing, right, if he had the benefit of housing stability and mental health services, then he may be alive today. And that tragedy could have been prevented. So this should reinforce our commitment to expanding access to mental health care and to supportive housing.
Rob?
So, first, good morning, everybody, and thank you to everybody at the network for inviting me. I have a long relationship of working with the network. I go back to Ted Houghton, who was a long time ED.
That's not that far back.
Well, but it's, it's a while, so I've worked with the network in many iterations. And it's an honor to be up here with these two distinguished panelists, right? I stood by the congressman on the steps of City Hall for many an action, working on housing issues, and, have worked closely with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. So it's a pleasure to be up here. And let me preface my comments by saying I'm formerly homeless. I know Stephen didn't introduce me that way, but I spent 2.5 years on the streets of Miami and 10 months in the New York City homeless shelter, and that's what brought me to this work. So you might hear some things that are very strong coming out of my mouth, but I wanted to qualify them. So I agree with many of the comments that the congressman has already made. No need for me to repeat that. I do look at it through a lens of humanity, and we've lost our humanity in this country. But for me, what brought me to activism is the narratives that we spin with respect to homelessness. And there were 4 that I heard coming out of shelter that really irritated me and brought me to this work. You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction. You're homeless because you have mental illness. And I'll start with mental illness. That's no reason to discard our brothers and sisters, right? We should gather around them for support, right? So it's always bothered me that these narratives were out there, and I've been spending the last 15 to 18 years trying to change those narratives by being very public about my own situation. But when you hear stories like we just heard about Jordan Neely, it really agitates me and says, I have to lift up other homeless people and bring them to the forefront. My voice is heard from New York City government all the way down to DC. I have some strong ties in HUD, and they reach out to me a lot to ask me questions. U.S. Interagency on Council on Homelessness constantly reaches out to me. But they need more than my voice, right? So I have to look at other folks who have gone through what a Jordan Neely and others have gone through to say they're human, and how do I bring them to the forefront? So it's been a charge that's been kind of a responsibility for me. But the congressman said it very clearly. I don't need to repeat it. I totally agree with what the congressman laid out.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to do my best here to fill in for Diane. I know there's some pretty big shoes to fill today, so I thank you for humbly accepting me onto this panel. So I guess I want to just start with, we can't ignore the role that race played in Jordan Neely's death, and that our country has a long history of racial discrimination, well, going back to land theft, enslavement, decades, generations of racial discrimination and injustice, and that persists in our policies, particularly in our housing policies today, and leaves people of color much more likely to become homeless, to be pushed into homelessness, and to be living on the edge and experiencing other challenges. So it was a tragic death, and NLHC, Diane Yentel put out a very strong statement condemning that right afterwards, and many other national leaders in the housing justice movement did as well. And as a staff member on the team, we felt really proud to be on that side of history, really condemning this death, this disturbing trend that we see in the criminalization of people experiencing homelessness, stripping away resources and services, and instead punishing them, criminalizing them, putting them in jail. That's a trend that's happening across the country that we're tracking and responding to very closely. But what struck me was Diane put this statement out, and I was the person responsible to kind of see the email responses to that this week. We share that throughout the coalition. And there were so many statements of support and gratitude and thanks from our members for that strong statement. There were also statements, again, you know, that had some severe concerns with our take on this issue, and people who said, please don't send me any more emails, you've gone too far. I don't want to be a member of your coalition anymore. It was really interesting to me to see, we have a very broad coalition of members, over 1,300 across the country, many, many more that receive our emails. And it was really striking to see the response there, even within the housing justice and affordable housing movement to this instance. So I just wanted to share that reflection too.
Thank you.
Great. An instant follow-up to that, we also issued a statement, had some of the same experiences, not so much because our world is a little more insulated and not national. But what can we do about that? You know, address the very mean-spirited pushback to almost anything that reeks of compassion. Rob, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I think it's about education, right? You say that word sometimes and people get offended. But one of the things I talk about in my own personal experience is being transformed by that experience. So as Lindsay mentioned early on, this country has a history that it doesn't necessarily put out front. But if you're somebody like me, a person of color, you understand how you were affected by that history. So I think it's important for us to educate. I talk about this in the social justice world all the time. We have to constantly do education. And I learned this from social movements outside of the US. I've been in Brazil every year since 2013 and work with the landless workers movement down there. And they have their own school, right? They put people through a school. If you're going to be an activist with the MSD, you have to go through this school. And they talk about social injustice, how it plays out in the community. So I think it's about education. We live in a polarized society, but until we start to come in a room and have conversations, I'm afraid it won't change, right? We can't sweep it under the rug. We can't pretend things didn't happen, right? You'll hear from me later on. I'm a big believer in human rights versus civil rights, right? Our Constitution is almost 250 years old, and it starts out with the line, "We the people." Who were those people when people like me were considered 3/5 of a man? It values property rights over people's rights. So it's problematic to me. But I look at countries outside of the US, South Africa, number one, new constitution, 1996, guarantees the human right to housing. And Abashale, based on Jondalo, the shack dwellers movement, had to fight, but they got into constitutional court in 2012 and won because it's written right on the Constitution in black and white. You have the human right to a home. Brazil's post-dictatorship constitution, written in 1985, guarantees the human right to a home or access to land. So it's different outside of the US. It's not a 250-year-old constitution. We need to take a look at ourselves in the mirror and maybe make some changes.
Congressman?
Look, I think we have to see more clearly the humanity of those who struggle with severe mental illness. If you're struggling with serious mental illness, like Jordan Neely, you're a victim of your condition, and you're a victim of the societal failure to address your condition. And you're not a criminal, you're a victim, and you should be treated with humanity and empathy. And I feel like the political discourse about homelessness and severe mental illness is often dehumanizing. We speak of those who might be street homeless and might have severe mental illness on the streets as if they're a sanitary problem that has to be swept up, rather than people with needs for homes and healthcare. And so I think we have to move away from the dehumanizing rhetoric that has become so common in our politics.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that a lot of things that are happening outside of this room at this conference, and please don't run to the exits when I say this, because it's sessions further in the day, but A lot of good news, mostly coming from New York State Office of Mental Health and others. You know, the good news that was alluded to earlier, 3,500 units of a variety of different housing that passed the budget this May, excuse me. And continuing the state's program for supportive housing, where we fell short, I think, in terms of the state budget this year, was pursuing a bold plan to address overall affordable housing. But there's some good things going on. And also the mental health plan has a lot of proactive outreach, peer activity to meet people where they're at. So I think I'll just mention, I think there is some hope that is lurking on the horizon. Unfortunately, not at this panel. So with that, do you want to go right into, Rob, talking about housing as a human right?
I think it's important in this. You know, I preface my comments saying I believe in human rights over civil rights, and I think it's important to make that distinction, right? And that comes, I'm blessed to serve as a special advisor for a human rights organization based here in New York called Partners for Dignity and Rights. But 2009 was a big moment, 2009, 2010. 2009, we had a visit, an official mission of a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. Raquel Rolnick visited 7 cities in the US, including New York City, and I was made the chairperson for that visit. As she visited these 7 cities across the nation and tried to better understand our housing conditions. And it was a response to social justice groups writing the UN and saying, we need help. Our government is not as responsive as it should be. And I think I learned from Raquel when she issued a report the following February with 108 recommendations to our federal and state government, also our local government here in New York, about changes with respect to the human right to housing. But fast forward to today, the last rapporteur prior to Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who serves in it right now, is Leilani Farhar, and she started a new organization called Make the Shift. I serve on her advisory committee because I learned from these folks what it really means. And I want, one thing I want to set forth in this room before, when I talk about a human right to a home, I want to make clear it doesn't mean you have to give away a home, right? You have to give a home to everybody. There are 7, we call them 7 elements of a human right to a home: security of tenure, availability of services, materials and infrastructure, affordability, accessibility, habitability, location, and cultural adequacy, which is one that we're always missing in this city, especially when you go into a place like East Harlem and you start to push people out through gentrification, but you don't respect the Latinos, the Cubans, the Afro-Cubans that lived there forever. When they get up and drum on a Saturday morning, that's part of their cultural heritage. But now you gentrify and you bring in people that aren't used to that culture and you want to push them out. They start to call police and saying, what's going on here? I have to listen to this noise outside of my window every morning? Well, cultural adequacy, we have to learn to accept. So I think, I don't want to pretend, and I understood what Stephen said, that, we don't have a lot of hope. I do have some hope, but I think hope comes from education and changing conditions, getting people to come to a room and have a conversation, putting us at a table and chopping it up, right? Rather than throwing dirt bombs at one another outside of a window or across a lot, right? We have to have conversations. We have to understand that this country was built on a premise that's incorrect, and how do we change that? How do we make reparations? And it's not always a check, folks. When I say reparations, I don't mean write a check to some people and make them happy. Let's change some of the conditions that we live in, that we know are wrong, that we swept under the rug, that we never talked about.
Great. Any other comments?
Oh, I just want to go back to the hope, because I do want to bring some hope to this panel too. And so just thinking about what we do have to be hopeful for in this moment, and what I see is a growing movement of housing advocates and pulling in other sectors that are intricately connected to housing, healthcare, racial justice, education, all of those sectors realize how foundational a stable housing is to all the people they're serving. And so NLIHC has worked in various ways with other national partners to really broaden the movement for just housing policy in particular, but for housing justice. And so that it's exciting to me to see new voices coming in, and also those voices can sometimes better speak to policymakers about the business case for housing, about the education case, about the food justice case, that housing advocates can't do as well.
All right. So I'd like to turn to the federal budget landscape, if we could, because I'm insisting that I bring everybody down. This year there was a budget agreement, as I understand it, that was part of a deal to extend the debt ceiling. And I'm wondering what the budget landscape is, particularly for housing, particularly for HUD. Lindsay, do you want to take a start at it, or should we let the congressman go first?
I was going to say, let's let the congressman start. He's a little closer to the issue.
Yeah. What can we do? We're coming to Washington in a month. What can we do in the next year to help build these programs to scale when, at best, we can hope for incremental increases? Your thoughts, Congressman?
Yeah, before I answer your question, I feel like it's worth adding some context around the debt limit deal.
Okay.
So I am a critic of the debt limit deal because for me, it was not about reducing the debt. It was about scapegoating and stereotyping poor people. The so-called debt limit deal increases defense spending, which will lead to more debt, not less. It decreases funding for tax enforcement, which will lead to more debt, not less. It imposes new restrictions on the SNAP program, which provides an average of $2 per meal, right? Reducing a food budget of $2 per meal does nothing to reduce the debt. And so I had real concerns about an agreement that makes it harder for poor people to access food and easier for rich people to cheat on their taxes. The agreement imposes spending caps, 2023 level spending caps, on all non-defense, non-veteran spending, which would include housing. And at a time of 4% inflation, that's the equivalent of a budget cut. And keep in mind, even if these cuts might seem marginal, these cuts add up over time. And these cuts are layered upon cuts that were made 10 years ago. Sequestration, there's been a long-standing crusade by the far right to starve the beast, to starve the social safety net. And there have been compounding budget cuts over time that have a real impact on our ability to address the affordability crisis. And HUD is the hardest hit because HUD has about a $14 billion hole left by the loss of FHA revenues. And so how are we going to fill that $14 billion hole within the constraints of these 2023 budget caps? That's going to be a real challenge, but we're going to need people to exert maximum pressure on the Appropriations Committee to ensure that affordable housing gets its fair share within that limited pie.
Can I just, I think we need to publicly acknowledge the congressman here because we've had representatives that have represented us before, but not in a way that this congressman is representing us, looking at the poor and focusing on the poor people. And I'm going to give you a perfect example. So in 2012, I was blessed to sit at a table invited by the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty as they were distributing what is called McKinney-Vento Awards. And I sat at a table having dinner. I was receiving an award for self-achievement, but Barney Frank, I don't know if you guys remember, Congressman Barney Frank was sitting at the table with me. And Barney Frank kind of let us know that night that he was going to quit Congress because he saw all of his fellow Congress people putting money into defense budget and forgetting about housing. He got so frustrated, he said he was going to quit. And he asked us at the table 2 questions that night. Which is the largest, he said, which is the largest air force in the world, right? And many of us were debating Israel or the U.S., so we settled on the U.S. And then he asked us which was the second largest air force. Then he said the U.S. Navy. And he asked us at the table, why do we have to be 1 and 2, right? We keep saying we want to defend the Pacific Rim, and that's how some of these folks have thought. Let's put more money into defense. China, I don't want to get into politics, but if China wanted to take over the Pacific Rim, they own it, right? They do own it, let's be honest, right? So, you know, to have a congressman sit here and talk about poor people, that's not what our representatives usually look like. So, again, I'm applauding the congressman for the work that he's doing and to speak out about this budget. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you for those.
Certainly echo that. We have some strong champions in Congress right now, and we really, really need them. I'm going to dare to get into the weeds a little bit, and please do correct me if I get anything wrong here, but you know, you probably saw the debt ceiling negotiations play out in the news media. What's happened in the last couple of weeks is that the House Appropriations Committee chair has decided not to even use basically the agreement that they made, and to actually start the budget process with a much lower number, bringing the budget, the top line numbers down to FY22 levels. So, you know, it'll have to be negotiated, but it's you know, it's an even worse deal, I guess, than was cut during the negotiations, at least to start with in the House. And when those numbers had been proposed earlier, Secretary Fudge sent a letter saying that at that level, it's estimated 1 million people could lose access to rental assistance, and tens of thousands of people experiencing homelessness now would lose access to services. So they're cuts that have real consequences. And so to pivot to the hope is that this is a chance for you all to really advocate with your members of Congress. What would those cuts look like in your communities for the people you serve? Bring people with a lived experience that are using the services, that need the services that aren't being funded now, to those meetings, to those members, to show them that there are real human faces behind these decisions that they're making. And we need to keep the pressure up. The budget negotiation is going to go on and on and on, probably right up till the end of the year. There will be threats of government default along the way as we hit different deadlines, and we need to keep the pressure up. The maybe silver, well, I don't know if there's any silver linings to it, but I will say that the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development budget contains, as it says, transportation funding. There's a chance, and again, Congressman, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's a chance that negotiating those cuts between HUD and transportation could prevent the worst from happening by cutting more of the funding from the transportation budget, and especially because transportation got a big boost with the recent infrastructure bill, there's a chance that some of those numbers could at least prevent the worst from happening. But we're advocating right now for increased funds. We won't stop that because we know more funds need to be in the budget, and particularly for the lowest income people and programs that serve them. So we'll be keeping that advocacy up, encourage you all to join us, and we have a lot of tools to make that really easy. The other potential is for a supplemental budget to be passed by the end of the year. Again, correct me if I'm wrong there, but you know, we're hoping with this pressure and these stories that you know, Congress will realize that these cuts are too severe for the public to bear.
I want to acknowledge again that we've got about a half hour with Congressman Torres. So, because you could be here to ask the moderator a lot of questions, but I don't think that's why you're here. So, if there's a microphone in the middle of the room, if there are folks that have questions that you want to ask, at least starting off asking the congressman while he's still here, that would be great. I see somebody possibly coming up to the microphone. No! Fooled again. While we're waiting, there are some people getting up. Good. Thank goodness, because it just takes one person to break the ice.
Yes. Hi, good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing? My name is Sabine. I'm from the New York City Department of Veterans Service. We serve those who served us. So if there's any servicemen and women in here or individuals, thank you so much for your service. Now, we are a country that constantly speak about how great our veterans are, how important our veterans are, how we support our servicemen and women. But we are not a country that has a lot of action that backs those statements. If we were, we would not have the number of veterans who are coming out of service being homeless as we do. As a matter of fact, we have so many veterans across the country who are leaving different states to come to New York because there's so very little services available to veterans in other states. So since we are now one of the states that are getting a surplus of veterans looking for services in terms of like medical, housing, and so forth, how do we go about creating set-aside units for veterans? Because right now, our veterans, our servicemen and women who are in the homeless shelter are competing against the entire homeless population for a few number of units. I've literally taken veterans to go see apartments where there was 30 people for one apartment. I understand the homeless situation in New York City is bad, and I feel bad across the board for our homeless situation. However, I do not feel like as a country that promotes our servicemen and women as much as we do, that we should have a veteran competing with 29 other individuals for one apartment. I think that we should have a system where every time our government gives multi-billion-dollar cut break to a management company to set aside 3 units for those $1 billion, one of those 3 units should be specifically earmarked for a veteran. Or whatever units we have available to us, this percentage should be earmarked for homeless veterans.
Great.
How do we go about creating that system?
I mean, obviously, VASH immediately comes to mind.
That's exactly.
VASH is a voucher. We give them the voucher, but then they have to find the apartments. And the landlords, quite frankly, don't care about our VASH. Why? Because they can get a cash-paying client that pays them more money. They don't have to worry about a NYSHA inspection. They don't have to worry about their payments not coming on time. They don't have to wait a month for the process to be complete. VASH is a voucher. We are now dealing about how do we use that voucher to get them into set-aside units just for veterans.
Well, go
well,
ahead.
Look, I mean, I just want to agree with your broader point, which is we are supporting veterans far less than we should. These are people who risk their lives for our country, and we've largely left them behind. The Obama administration was making real progress toward reducing veteran homelessness, and then those gains were reversed under the Trump administration. It's worth noting that we did pass a bipartisan veteran health care bill that will invest more than $200 billion in veteran health care, did it on a bipartisan basis. But ultimately, and one of the silver linings in the debt limit deal is that it does insulate the Department of Veteran Affairs from budget cuts. It allows that area of spending to grow. But I think the issue that you raise, I'm certainly in favor of more set-asides for veterans. I'm certainly in favor of prioritizing veterans when it comes to public housing and Section 8. But the issue that you raise, I think, is larger, which is the lack of housing supply. The federal government should be playing a much greater role in expanding housing supply in cities like New York so that there's far less competition, so that it's far less of a scarce resource. The scarcity of housing is a self-inflicted wound. We have the tools to expand housing supply. What is lacking is the political will. There are several categories of public projects. I believe airports might be one of them that's exempt from volume cap. Affordable housing is a public good that should be exempt from volume cap. We have the capacity, the affordable housing industry has the capacity to create far more affordable housing than we do. What is limiting that capacity is politics in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's a great comment.
Go ahead, Stephen.
No, after you.
I want to come back to the issue of VASH because I was very involved with the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. When they initially started in 2010, 30 government agencies, federal agencies, coming together to end homelessness in 10 years, right? Tall task, couldn't do it. They took a step back and they focused on veterans homelessness, came up with the VASH voucher. I think it speaks to, and this is, I'm a big I'm a big believer in what you laid out. A voucher is a piece of paper. It doesn't guarantee you anything. But it does speak to source of income discrimination to me, right? Which I think is a big issue here in New York. And I worked with some groups here to get it on the mayor's desk, and we work with Jessica Katz to get it in the forefront here. And we're challenging that. Some budget shifts have happened here in New York with respect to source of income discrimination, because we have Section 8 vouchers, we have city FEPS vouchers, and we have some state vouchers. So we know there's issues out there, and we're doing some testing. I think what we have to do is really, and a little inside baseball here, HUD has issued some grants for folks to work with universities and community members. And I'm working with a Queens College professor who applied for one of those grants, and we want to focus on source of income discrimination across the country. So I do think there's a wave of people working on that issue. Doesn't answer the question that you just asked. I think the congressman did a better job, and we have to focus on building more, but as long as land is commodified the way it is, we're gonna struggle, right? And I'm not siding with developers here. What I'm saying is, and go back to put my international hat on, the city of Helsinki, Finland, doesn't have a homeless problem because they own 70% of the land. So they decide how to build. So it's a different perspective. So I think we have to think outside of the box, I guess, if you were to put everything that I said, what different ways can we attack this problem? I had a quick conversation with Lindsay before we started this panel, and I talked about doing some research for a London School of Economics professor. And that research involved homelessness in New York in the late 80s and early 90s. And as I was doing the research, I kept saying, we ain't doing something right because we're still doing the same things and expecting a different result. So we got a problem. So we have to think outside of the box. If folks, if you want to ask questions, please just walk up to the mic.
And I just add briefly that the state's ESHI program has a veterans set aside. You could certainly use VASH as project-based rental assistance. Okay. And there's probably ways to incentivize that on the VA front, but go ahead.
Thinking outside of the box, right?
Well, that's why I get paid. Yes, Lindsay?
I was just going to add a couple things to that last question about the patchwork of federal tenant protections that exists and speak to people traveling state lines to get better services or better treatment. That what we really need are robust tenant protections, such as source of income discrimination at the federal level. And there is a bill that's been introduced this year called the Fair Housing Improvement Act. It's certainly something that would protect what income source you're using to pay for your housing. Encourage you guys to advocate for that, and I'm happy to talk more about that. Right now, the Federal Housing Finance Agency is also accepting public input about creating and enforcing renter protections for all properties with a federally backed mortgage. All rental properties, so that could impact 12 million people in those properties. So it's significant. It's not everybody, it's not universal protections, but NLHC is certainly pushing for people to come out in full force with comments about what protections are needed, how they need to be enforced and mandated. So happy to talk more about those opportunities.
Go ahead.
Thanks for all your comments. I think that we're forever grateful to all of you working at the federal level to preserve those resources that are oftentimes overlooked for housing for people in great need. But I think we're realizing, and we just went through this with New York State, is that the supply of housing has become a critical factor in all of this, and the local resistance by local municipalities to modifying zoning and other building impediments is at the core at this point. And so it seems that there's been a great deal of public media coverage of the affordable issue. Finally, housing affordability is not just a blue state issue, it's happening across the country. Will this become an important issue in upcoming political campaigns, locally and in statewide? We can't just rely on elected representatives in Washington to cut the deals. We need localities to be directed by elected officials who realize that there's a need to increase the supply of housing.
Great.
Well, I'm in agreement with you, and I would submit to you there's no greater threat to our ability to address both the affordability crisis and the climate crisis than NIMBYism. And it's not only an affordable housing issue. I think we're going to have real trouble building clean energy infrastructure, transmission infrastructure because of NIMBYism. Look, the affordability crisis exists because the demand for housing far exceeds the supply. Like, we cannot address the affordability crisis without expanding supply, and we cannot expand supply in the face of NIMBYism. And in New York City, and I was a former council member, we have a system of what I call municipal feudalism, in which each council member treats a council district as a personal fiefdom.
That's right.
And each council member gets to decide what gets built and how much gets built. And I find that the public review process is not as public as advertised, that process, that deceptively democratic process, is often hijacked by a visible vocal minority of well-connected, deep-pocketed activists who want to keep their neighborhoods quote-unquote pristine and want to protect quality of life and character and all that coded language. Francis Fukuyama has a term, vitocracy, government by veto, right? The Euler process is vitocracy pretending to be democracy. And so what we need is a streamlined, expedited land use process for affordable housing development in New York City. We are making progress, but not as, the governor's plan did die in the face of opposition. But I think there has to be a recognition that you cannot call yourself a progressive and then support the obstruction of affordable housing and support a land use process that rewards NIMBYism and entrenches the power of what I think is a systemically racist status quo. Nowhere is systemic racism more pronounced than in the area of housing. And that exclusionary zoning is entrenched by the status quo. And there are members on the right and the left who have a vested interest in preserving that status quo. And we need to call them out. And I feel like there's been more, now obviously California has had far more regressive policies than we've had, but YIMBYism, yes, in my backyard, has seen more momentum in the West Coast than it is in the East Coast. But we're making progress.
So that lack of democracy that you talk about, I like to use the term, they say, we did a consultation in your neighborhood. No, it was a non-sultation. Your mind was made up when you came into the room, right? So stop it, right? And we have to call it out. We really have to call it out and confront it. And I think sometimes people are afraid to do that.
But even when there is consultation, the community boards are often unrepresentative of the community. But that's just, I have, one of my community boards represents a neighborhood that's primarily renters, primarily people of color. The board is disproportionately white and disproportionately homeowners, and their interests are quite different from the interest of the overall neighborhood. I don't consider that democracy.
How did they get on the community board?
The elected officials, not me. But
Right, so whose interest do you have in mind? So we need to understand these processes, folks, and we need to change them, right? Community board members are appointed, so whose interest do you have in mind, right? They need to be elected by us if they're going to represent us.
My name is Arvind Suknanan, and
I thought I was going to see you in the Bronx, sir.
I am. I'm going to see you right after this, I think. But I just wanted to say I'm a proud member of Fountain House Bronx. I'm also on the board of Fountain House, and I am also a constituent of Congressman Torres. And I don't want to make this a party about Ritchie, but he's the only elected representative right now at the conference. So I just want to point that out, folks. That's a big deal that you're here. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Well, I should confess I have a twin, so I can be in two places at once.
That would be great for our country. My question is, as someone with serious mental illness and who had experienced homelessness, I know firsthand how bureaucratic and hard it is to get housing and how long the wait is. The system in place doesn't really, effectively get people like me into housing, and especially on an emergency basis. Things like vouchers, and even though it is illegal for landlords to discriminate against vouchers and stipends, it still happens all the time. And then on top of that, the system in place it doesn't help someone with serious mental illness. One of the worst things your illness does to you is take away your ability to advocate for yourself. And especially in a system like this, and where there's so much bureaucracy, it makes someone completely overwhelmed. How can we, at federal, state, and local levels of government, implement policy that, helps make a more effective transition from being homeless to housed?
Well, the most successful, thank you for everything you do, and the most successful model is housing first, which to me is common sense, that if you provide someone with a stable place to live, you're going to enable a broader stabilization of their life. And housing first is under siege from the Republicans in Congress. It's become one of the buzzwords that triggers the far right in American politics. Republicans, some of them would have you believe that employment and sobriety should be a precondition for housing. It's the exact opposite, that if you have housing, then you're going to be in a much stronger position to achieve sobriety, to achieve employment, and achieve overall stability. And that just that is common sense, but that common sense is under siege from the far right. So we have to defend what works, and we should defend the Housing First program from the politically motivated crusade that's unfolding in Washington, D.C. I mean, I think the results from Pathways to Housing is astonishing. After 5 years, 88% of the people remain housed. Like, that level of success is rare in government programs. I mean, that's just
Great, yeah, and continuing care funded programs. Lindsay, do you have a
Yeah,
additional
just
comment?
building off of that, I mean, housing programs are chronically underfunded. They have been for decades and decades. And so we need to fund more Housing First programs at all levels of government. We need to change the narrative about what Housing First is, how successful it is. Study after study shows how it's a far more successful model. But it's under attack, and a bill has been introduced called the Housing Plus Act, which would effectively defund Housing First model programs from COCs. So it's something NLHC's been speaking out against, and have many partners at the national level doing so as well. But I just wanted to get that bill on your radar. It was introduced by Representative Andy Barr from Kentucky. The Housing Plus Act would harm Housing First funding.
Yeah, and we always say at the network, because we're, supportive housing is built on a Housing First model, that it's housing first, it's not housing only, and the services component is what gets really starved. You'll hear this in other panels today, and it's part of our ongoing work to not forget about the workforce and the services that they bring, and the welcoming attitude and the skill set that it takes to support someone coming from homelessness into housing and to make it work. So that's a commercial message from the network. Go ahead.
And I'll just excuse the exceptionalist attitude in this country. Finland, as a government, implemented Housing First. If you were to receive any money from the government of Finland, it had, for Housing Plus services, you had to use the Housing First model, implemented in 2008. Now the European Union is picking up on it because they realize Finland is doing a good job reducing their homeless numbers.
And look, and there's a sense in which most of us who are not homeless are living housing first, right? We've had housing first in our lives, which has enabled us to achieve education and healthcare. And so, that's a principle that we're just living in our lives. And any Republican who opposes it should just volunteer to be homeless and see how easy it is to achieve services.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you for being here, panelists. In terms of increasing supply, with building development usually being a local issue, what do you think federal strategy should be to mandate or incentivize local building to increase that supply? And if we do increase that supply, what strategies are there to keep that from being just a giveaway to developers and making sure that any units built are affordable?
There's a limit to what we can do, but the federal government could leverage the power of federal funds to either incentivize or mandate the construction of more housing. So we could take the incentive approach. If you create more housing, we'll provide you with more infrastructure funding, or in order to receive infrastructure funding, you have to allow for the creation of more affordable housing. You have to achieve these density targets. I'm skeptical about the incentives. I feel the mandates are much more effective than the incentives, but I would leverage the power of federal funding to mandate affordable housing construction or impose density targets on states and localities seeking federal funds. And you would have to do it not only with housing funds, but with broader infrastructure funds, because there are communities that could care less about the housing funds, but do care about the infrastructure funds. So you would need buy-in from an agency like DOT. What was the second question? I'm sorry.
If we do increase the supply, what's to keep that supply, the funds going to build that supply, would just be a good way for developers to make sure that any units built are actually affordable. I know that.
Yeah, I disagree with some of the advocates on this. There's a school of thought that if only we were to change the AMI, then we would magically have deeply affordable housing. And the issue is not the definition, the issue is the lack of money. Like, you can redefine affordable housing, but if there's no new money, there's gonna be no deeply affordable housing. So, I'm all for redefining AMI at the neighborhood level, at the zip code level. Frankly, I think the best definition is public housing in Section 8, 30% of one's gross adjusted income. But ultimately, what matters is not the definition that we adopt, it's the funding, the subsidy. The lack of housing subsidy is the problem that we have to address at the federal level. Because if you provide supportive housing developers with more subsidy, they will create more supportive housing, which is deeply affordable housing. And the same is true of Section 8 and public housing. And if you expand, project-based tenant vouchers, that's going to create more deeply affordable housing.
Can I build on that too?
Oh, boy.
Because NLHC is a strong advocate for deeply affordable housing. That is our primary kind of thesis, because we see the needs are so severe for the lowest income people, the fewest options, the highest cost burdens, et cetera. So when, federal funds trickle down to the local level, so it's important to advocate for the money in Congress too. And the National Housing Trust Fund is a program designed to subsidize deeply affordable housing. It's unique in that regard. So that's always our top priority for appropriations, is the National Housing Trust Fund, to provide that supply side, but for deeply affordable housing. We recognize that the low-income housing tax credit program is kind of a primary funding mechanism. We also advocate for stronger reforms to that to enable it to better serve lower income people, because on its own, it's not always reaching extremely low income households, just the subsidy amounts aren't quite there, but there are reforms within that program that we're pushing for to enable it to better serve people on lower incomes and with greater needs.
Thanks, Lindsay. And we love the Housing Trust Fund. I'm going to circle back to that in the latter part of our discussion maybe, but this gentleman has a question which might be the last question for the congressman.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to housing first and sort of push that concept a little bit further, which I think often about what Jessica Katz said about New York City proclaiming itself to have a housing first approach, but it's really a paperwork first approach. And I think that approaches are good, but the details sort of the programs live and die in the details and the regulations that are made, right? So in order to get into supportive housing in New York City, you have to sit with a social worker and tell them your deepest, darkest, most horrific traumas in order for them to sort of assess whether or not you deserve housing. And you have to produce your birth certificate in order for the National Low-Income Housing Tax Credit or for any of these other subsidies. So what are the sort of like regulatory changes that could be made that wouldn't necessarily require full legislative changes that could sort of move the needle closer to that?
I'm going to defer to the Supportive Housing Network, but I agree with you, and I feel like the process can be too bureaucratic, and I prefer to err on the side of common sense. But as a general proposition, there's often a trade-off between efficiency and integrity. And if you do create a more efficient process, there is a risk of people, we want to make sure that the people in greatest need are going into supportive housing, right? So I think that's why some of these controls are in place, So that's just a trade-off we should think about, but I'm all for streamlining the process, and I would leave it to the technocrats here to figure out how to do it.
Can I wager an offer here?
Sure.
Okay. So I just want to say that we learned a lot of lessons during the pandemic about new innovations in program design. And when I know probably many of you all were implementing or supporting the emergency rental assistance program, we stood that up very, very quickly and learned a lot along the way. And so I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned about quickly approving people categorical eligibility for services, income, proxy and other flexibilities that were allowed in certain states to implement that program that could translate to other federal programs. And we'll be writing up some research reports over the next year to highlight those and how they might be useful in other federal housing programs.
And I'll just,
go ahead.
yeah, I'll follow up real quick and say that we've seen, as Lindsay said, through the pandemic, that you can do it if you want to, a different way, right? And I don't want to put our former chief housing officer out there or her personal reasons for stepping down, but that was a focus of her work, right? Streamlining those processes, right? She had understood the difficulty and the impact that we put on people applying for these benefits. And why do you stress people out like that, right? Especially here in New York, folks. Those of you in New York, right? If you're going for Section 8 or one of those programs, HPD asks you for information, HRA asks you for the same information. These are two city agencies. Why aren't they talking to one another? And why are they putting the pressure on the person who's homeless? It's ridiculous, right? And that's what she was working on streamlining.
Yeah. Look, there's often a long lag between when an apartment is ready to be occupied
This is true.
and when it's actually occupied.
That's right.
And that's all paperwork. That's I think Jessica Katz literally wrote a report, Brutal Bureaucracy.
There you go.
But
I didn't want to say it, but thank you to the congressman for saying it.
All right, one more, it looks like, and then I'll satisfy my
Hello?
friends. Go
This
ahead.
mic is working, or can I
Yeah.
just project?
No, you're good.
The mic is working.
So considering the prompt of this particular section, right, imagining a world without homelessness, I think we've all experienced post-pandemic, we're thinking about the housing crisis, we're thinking about socioeconomic crisis, discrimination and the discrimination that's built into the fabric of our country are all coalescing at the same time. So I am interested and intrigued about the prompt itself and how you individual moderators feel, or what you all are thinking of what would a world considering all of these coalescing factors, right? Late stage capitalism is what we're existing in. So where does this come together? What are the immediate issues, and what does imagining a world to each of you look like, considering all of these factors? I know this is very much so a theoretical prompt in some ways. You mentioned Finland, and there's so many factors as to why that works, but that considering that model applied to us, what does it look like? Because we have to get creative. We're at a climate crisis, and understanding the stratification of wealth gaps and population impact, we're really hitting a precipice of honestly decline and faltering as a society, at least in my opinion, right? These factors are interfaced. So considering this imaginative exercise, and the people who consider and care about these things are all sitting in this room, what does that mean for you guys in imaginative exercise that hopefully can become real life application?
Deep.
Congressman, you
Deep.
can you just can you just summarize your question in one more sentence? I just want to make sure I'm
No, there was definitely a lot
Yeah.
in there. As a society, we're dealing with a lot. So
yeah.
considering the prompt, imagining a world without homelessness, what do you as individuals, and they don't have to be the same, they don't have to coalesce, because it is also informed by your individual background. So I'm curious, based on your experience, based on your fields, what do you and what factors would get us there to a world without homelessness?
Hard to answer that question, but I would say, we're living in a time of, notwithstanding the Supreme Court's invalidation of affirmative action, we're living in a time of racial enlightenment and racial reckoning and heightened racial consciousness. And we see the failings of the criminal justice system through a racial lens. It has been frustrating that there has not been a comparable commitment to seeing the affordability crisis through a racial lens. That when you obstruct the creation of affordable housing, when you weaponize the land use process to stifle affordable housing for lower income communities, there are people who are unable to see that as playing a role in systemic racism and perpetuating racial inequality in America. You brought up late stage capitalism. I wonder, does widespread homelessness say something about late stage capitalism, or does it say something about the United States? Because much of the world is capitalist, but we're unique in the industrialized world. We're exceptionally cruel to our own people. The industrialized world is almost all capitalist, but we're the only society in the industrialized world that has no comprehensive social contract or social safety net, that has widespread gun violence, widespread homelessness, widespread housing insecurity. And so I actually feel like this problem is technically and easily solvable, but it's made unsolvable by the exceptional dysfunction and cruelty and callousness of American politics. But we have the tools. Like, I'm not clear that we need to radically restructure capitalism. We just need to provide enough funding to create enough housing for the people who need it. I think this is an eminently solvable problem that's made unsolvable by the stupidity of politics in Washington, D.C.
What is your name?
Nantara.
Nantara, you pushed a button with me. I told many of you I teach at the new school. I've been influenced by, many of you know the Marxist theorist David Harvey. I was brought to the City University of New York Graduate Center as a formerly homeless person by Neil Smith, who was taught by David Harvey. Every Friday morning I have coffee with Richard Wolff, who's a professor of economics, a visiting scholar at the New School, and a former economics professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So I'm influenced by people who think other worlds other than capitalism. From what I went through, it transformed me. It changed the way I think about this world, and I agree with many of the problems that we have in this country and the cruelty that the congressman just laid out. But the work that I did early on in my organizing career was with Take Back the Land after the post-foreclosure crisis, where we said our government bailed out banks, right? And those banks turned around, the government took our tax money, bailed out the banks, and it sent a message. It's okay for you to fail, but Bank of America can't fail. So our response as African American who were feeling the brunt of this was to organize ourselves around the country to say, we're going to take those houses back. So we would break in those houses, and I'm saying this publicly, we would break in those houses and move the families back in there and defend their rights to be in there using international human rights law, right? And I still believe in that. So what I'm saying is fundamentally change our relationship to land. The land is a commodity and housing is a commodity does not work for us. That's the mountain that I stand on. That has to change. And if that means capitalism falls, bye-bye, right? So we have to have a new economic system. That's what I believe in, right? Because as an African American, this is 250 years of shit, and I'm kind of tired of it. And it don't seem like it's changing, right? So it changes when we force change. The only social change we've seen in this country has come as a result of direct action or civil disobedience, and that's what Take Back the Land was all about. So that's my thinking.
I'm the moderator, so I don't have to answer that question, thankfully. But Congressman, I thank you for your time. Are we beholden to your scheduler, or are we beholden to wanting to have you here forever and really appreciate you for the next half hour?
The Health and Human Service Secretary is coming to my district, so I probably should show up.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You're a breath of fresh air, and thank you for all you do. Let's give him a hand.
I'm so sorry, sir. May I ask a question? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. Yes.
Yeah, sure,
That I'm
sure.
understanding this right.
Sure.
So you're saying if there is an empty house in my neighborhood and I have a homeless veteran family, if my homeless veteran family and I break into that house, we can call you and you will defend their right to stay in that house.
You know about, do you know about Moms for Housing in the Bay Area?
I'm sorry?
These Moms for Housing, do you know about that movement in the San Francisco Bay Area?
No.
These were homeless women who took control of their lives, right? While they were homeless on the street with their children, they saw vacant, empty houses in their neighborhood. They broke in them and they moved families in there. And eventually the California government figured out a way to house these folks on a permanent basis, right? So direct action and civil disobedience brings about social change. So I'm saying yes.
So, okay. Thank you.
Lindsay, play or pass?
Yeah, I just want to add to this. I'm learning so much. I'm so inspired by your words today. And to me, this is what a world without homelessness looks like. It's people who've experienced these tragedies leading the movement and really innovating and bringing that kind of hope and inspiration and that transformation to our society's systems. It has to be led by people who have been directly harmed by these systems.
Folks, Google Moms for Housing. That was when, I was involved in the work of Take Back the Land. There's a Take Back the Land archive at the University of Miami where they started, right? Because students were coming in and asking about our work. But Moms for Housing went above and beyond. These were homeless mothers with children who said, you know what? There's an empty house there. I'm moving my family in. Doesn't make sense.
Hi.
I'm building on what you're saying. I feel that this conversation is missing what we should be asking of the private sector. Billions and billions of dollars is earned by private real estate developers in New York. And I feel like what we're almost discussing supportive housing and housing for homeless individuals as a separate world, disconnected from the thousands and thousands of private sector apartments with increasing rents. So I'm curious from the two of you, nationally, locally, where you have seen more asked from the private sector to support what we all understand to be a societal problem and a problem that, if solved, would benefit everyone.
I can give one example of the New Jersey fair share model. So in New Jersey, each region, county is required to plan and develop its fair share of that region's affordable housing needs. And a study is conducted every so often to determine what those, what that unit count is, what the needs are, the income levels, et cetera. And then a plan has to be created by that municipality to build to those targets. And all developers need to fit within that plan. And it's enforced, it's not perfect, but it certainly has resulted in the production of not just more affordable housing, subsidized housing, but evenly distributed throughout the whole state. So I do think that's a model that we can learn from. And the Fair Share Housing Center of New Jersey recently wrote up a report to elevate the success that they've had over the last 10, 15 years with this model to help other states figure out similar policies that they might want to implement.
So I think that is a great model. I've been looking at that New Jersey model, but I think we have to just think differently in this world, right? Tish James, when she was a council member, once said at a conference, development is to New York as oil is to Texas. Well, how do we change that, right? We have to change that. We have to rethink that. And I think it starts with elected officials. We have to get the right people in office. We just had an election where less than 20% of registered voters showed up. We have to get the right people elected in office to make this change. And I don't think we think that way. I will just say, no disrespect to the people who lost their position, but there's a wind of change in East New York, Brooklyn, right? Charles Barron lost his seat. People are sending a message, they want change. I live in Harlem. Inez Dickens is out, People said, the old guard got to go. We want change. So we have to think differently, right? And we have to come together as a community to understand that this is a societal problem, right? This is the approach that I take. Homelessness is a societal problem. It's not the individual problem that we paint it to be. This is a societal problem. And in particular, we have to look at it differently in different localities. It's expensive to be housed in New York, right? And the fundamental problem that we have in this country is rents rise faster than wages. So there's always going to be a problem. In a city like this where air rights are for sale, the problem is magnified, and it's just increased so many times over.
Great.
Hi, yes. Actually, I had a question directly related to what you just said, which is how much of the housing affordability crisis could be alleviated if there were fair living wages, you know,
A lot
for
of it
people
would,
throughout
listen,
the country, and is there any political will to actually make that happen at some point?
So, you know, obviously, folks have heard enough from me. I study a lot in the international community, right? And we saw during the pandemic that our government was able to supply us with checks when needed, right? Because their reason was they wanted to stem the economy. They wanted to infuse the economy. But if you look at the Nordic countries, they say if your family doesn't make 20, our minimum wage or our minimum standard of living is 20,000. If your family only brings in 16, then you get a $4,000 check, right? I got a $1,200 check. I didn't need it. I'm not rich, but I was, you know, that check didn't change my lives in any way when I got it, threw it in the bank, right? So why can't we do it? Everybody who got a $1,200 check doesn't necessarily need one. We're a smart enough country to be able to figure that out. So, it's a combination of political will, different thinking, coming together as human beings. We have to change. There is a division in this country that, and an exceptionalist attitude, and it starts at the government, it comes all the way down, it starts on the ground, and it pushes all the way up. It has to change. We have to care for one another. We have to change. It's problematic in this country. This is what forced me to organize so much outside of the U.S. I was in Barcelona, Spain in November, just Thanksgiving week. And I was there with a group called La Paz, the platform of people affected by mortgages in Brazil. And there was a family that was going to be evicted on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. And I know La Paz from my work here, so I wanted to be with that family on the streets. And you know what La Paz did? They turned out 150 people in front of that family's house, and the landlord's lawyers showed up on the street and negotiated a deal right there because the community cared. There was breakfast out there. We were all fed. It was a community coming together to support a family. We have to think outside of the box, folks. We have to change. This individualism that we have in this country is going to destroy us.
Great. Lindsay?
I want to add on, I was waiting for someone to ask about wages and housing costs because I have so much data that I want to share. I'm going to summarize it, but that's one of our, the signature things NLHC does is produce data reports, and we want it to be really useful for you all in your advocacy. So whether it's for increasing minimum wage or increasing funding for subsidized housing, you can use the same number. So the latest Out of Reach report came out just a couple of weeks ago, shows that on average in our country, you need to be making over $28 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, working just full time. That's the housing wage for a 2-bedroom apartment. Here in New York, it's over $40 an hour. You need to make over $40 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And if you can't, then or you need to be working a minimum wage job for 113 hours a week. So it's crazy, yes, we've raised our minimum wage, but not nearly to what the housing costs are. They're rising and rising faster. So having this kind of data to bring to policymakers helps them think, who could work more than 2 full-time jobs? What are the dynamics happening? How much, and we have that data at a metro level, at every county level, at a state level. You can compare other, states and jurisdictions. So I just want to put that out there because housing costs have far outpaced wages, and it's gotten worse as the supply is shrinking, basically.
It's a real valuable tool to share with any electeds at any level.
$47.13. That's the wage in New York City.
Incredible.
For a 2-bedroom apartment.
So, bottom line, you need a subsidy, or most people need a subsidy, right? Yeah.
And let's see, we're wrapping up shortly. I think we got to be done in a minute or less, but you have a question?
Sorry, I didn't realize how close we were to the end. I guess my question kind of builds on what we were speaking to before about how developers impact the role of housing affordability in the city. I also just kind of, part of homelessness and housing affordability in general pushes up against the fact that so much of our rental properties are mass owned by private equity companies, and they're just sort of a bit able to, without being checked by the government, raise rents as much as they want according to their whim. And I appreciate you speaking about David Harvey, admire of his, and I look towards projects like in Berlin where they were able to re-socialize a lot of housing that was previously owned by developers, and even just other places where they've been able to achieve anything as simple as rent control. And I have a difficult time, and I guess I do understand it, but it's difficult to grapple with the fact that we can't have something like that here, and what efforts we can make to kind of make something like that ever happen here if it can.
Don't say we can't. Let's distinguish we can't before political will, right? And the willingness to do it by greedy developers looking for profit over people, right? So we have to be honest about that. I think Vienna does a great job with social housing. There's a bunch of folks from New York that travel to Vienna in October. That's a model that we can look at that works. France does a good job with social housing. You know, it's a little bit a combination of some other things with our public housing, but I think we can reinvent housing, right? Public housing was once the social safety net in this country for people who couldn't afford housing, but we demonized it after the Reagan administration started pulling back funds, right? And then I think the other thing is we have to think differently, right? We subsidize wealthy homeowners, you know, with a mortgage tax deduction more than we do poor people, right? So it's a contradiction, right? So we stand up and say how much we do for poor people. Well, it's a contradiction because you're subsidizing wealthy homeowners through the mortgage tax deduction. So we need to understand these things, and we need to challenge our elected officials. I think we can be creative. I've seen it in other countries. But again, the political will here and the education of the people to understand these different processes and push back on a system that's been pushing down on them is part of the problem. We have to get rid of this individualistic way that we live our lives here, right? I grew up in Long Island. I grew up in a single-family home. But I remember as a kid, Mom and Dad putting up a fence because the Smiths across the street put a fence on their property. The Smiths got a new car. My dad had to buy a new car. What kind of competition shit is this, man, right? How do we build neighborhoods that work for all of us, right? And think differently. And I think fundamentally changing our fundamental relationship to land. I'm not saying there can be people who want to own land and do whatever you want with it, but I think it's a struggle for a big section of the population in this country. And how do we change that? Well, we have to come up with some creative ways. I serve on one way to do it here. There is a Cooper Square Community Land Trust in the Mutual Housing Association. I serve on that board. That is a model for us. It was a struggle in the 80s, but Francis Golden and some others won that right, and it's changed the lives of some people that live on the Lower East Side. So there are models. The Dudley Square Community Land Trust up in Massachusetts works, right? So there are models around the country, but how do we sprout more of those? How do we put more of those out there? I think we have to think creatively, and we have to be willing to give up some things, right? So we have to give up that individualism. And, you know, I got a house. Lindsay should work hard like I did and get her house, right? Come on, man. It's not that easy for everybody. We have to think differently.
I know you have a few things to say about
final
this.
Thoughts, yeah, about just that power, the power imbalance that exists between landlords and tenants is a huge, huge problem. And I know many advocates worked hard to get some tenant protections passed through the legislature this year. But while it maybe wasn't successful in New York this session, there is definitely a growing trend across the country to pass state and local tenant protections. And we've been tracking that in different categories of stabilization or anti-rent gouging or source of income protections, the gamut. And since the started the pandemic, which is really when a lot of these issues started to really come into public consciousness, over 200 tenant protections have been implemented. And so it's exciting for us to see, and we're trying to help communities learn and share what's successful, what advocacy tactics worked to get that in their state or community.
Can I just say 3 quick bills Maxine Waters out of California has just proposed? The Housing Crisis Response Act, Ending Homelessness Act of 2023, and Down Payment Toward Equity Act. Google those acts. I think there's some strong language in there that can make some significant change. Maxine Waters gets a lot of pushback because of her age, but she's always somebody who thought outside of the box, and I certainly support her, and I would encourage others to support what she's doing, and I'll reach out. I told the congressman I'm going to reach out to him about those bills.
Yeah, and he sits on the committee that Maxine chairs, so
That's right.
it's perfection.
That's right.
Before we go, Lindsay, the other piece of research that National Low Income Housing Coalition does that I find really valuable is the gap report.
Mhm.
And the specific thing that blows my mind and I find very useful is the concept that there's enough housing for people in the bottom half of the income structure of the country, but where the gaps are in the 0 to 30% AMI range, and that's where 3 people in that range are looking for, trying to find the one available and affordable apartment. So can you add anything to that? Am I getting it right?
I can give you a few more statistics. So this really is NLHC's thesis, is that there are the fewest resources, housing resources available to the lowest income people, and why we want every federal dollar and program targeted to extremely low income people. So in New York, 28% of all households are extremely low income. And that's different than in other states. Of them, 73% are extremely cost burdened, paying more than 50% of their income towards their housing costs.
What percentage?
73%.
Say that again?
73% of the lowest income people in our state are paying more than 50% of their income
I
towards
know the
housing.
number, but I just wanted to.
Yeah,
hear it.
and again, that's higher
At
than
least
in a
it's
lot
not
of
3/4.
Yeah, exactly, right?
So, and of those 28% that are extremely low income, 39% are seniors, 16% are disabled, 30% are in the labor force, but they're just not making enough to be able to afford their housing. So as Steve was saying, the gap is most severe. The gap in number of affordable homes for extremely low income people, it's most severe for the lowest income people. So there are 32 homes available and affordable for every 100 extremely low income households looking for those. But at 100% of area median income, there are 94 units of housing available. So it's a much smaller gap. And that's why all of our priorities focus on those with the greatest needs.
Great. And therefore the National Housing Trust Fund, which is becoming more huge, and I would encourage anyone to advocate for other sources of funding for the trust fund, because growing that is going to be a large part of the solution. Anyway, any other questions from the audience? I want to thank the audience for asking all the questions I had on my list. That was really great of you. I didn't even share them beforehand, but you were really attentive and wonderful. And more importantly, I'd like to thank the panelists. Rob, you're a wise man.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lindsay, I'm going to tell your boss she doesn't need to come to our conference anymore. Thanks to all.
I just want to say to you guys before you go, the work of Take Back the Land was very important to me. I still stand on that mountain, and that's learning from people outside of the U.S. But our tagline at the time was, we put homeless people in peopleless homes, right? During the middle of the foreclosure crisis, there were 14 million vacant homes, 750,000 homeless people across the U.S. We just played matchmaker. I don't, but I can